My name is Jeremy Parsons. I'm a Senior Project Manager for the Ground Systems Development and Operations Program. In that role, I'm the Project Manager at the Launch Equipment Test Facility for our program. And so, where I kind of started and where I came up was I was an operations engineer starting in the space station program. And so there, I worked payloads, I worked, working management of each of our individual space station missions, managing schedule and processing payloads and things like that. And then eventually I moved over to Constellation, working operations planning. I was a branch chief, a technical operations manager, things along those lines. And then ultimately I moved into project management and worked the development side of things. And so we built hardware. And then now, what's really cool is we're in the testing phase. So we did planning, design, and so I've worked operations. And then what's really cool is now then I kind of went back and did the planning, design, and now we're back in the testing and operations phase of it. And so it's really kind of a neat aspect to be able to see the whole life cycle of a program. And so I've seen it from back in the shuttle phase and the ISS phase of operations and life cycle to the planning, design, and execution of it. And so really where we're at now in the LETF is we're in the execution and testing, so we can go put it up on the mobile launcher and get ready to get into the launch phase again. So what is the Launch Equipment Test Facility? And it's funny, right? The launch equipment, the LETF, which is what we call it, is one of those facilities that's kind of like a little known gym at the Kennedy Space Center, because it's one of those things you can drive by 100 times and you might not ever notice it. It's just these big steel structures. And what's really neat about it is one of a kind. Probably at least in the US. And what it is it's where we are able to test out each of our launch umbilicals before we go into an actual launch. And so what are those launch umbilicals? So if you look at a picture of the Space Launch System, which is our new big rocket, right? If you look at a picture of the Space Launch System, the SLS and the Orion, on launch day, you have all of these large umbilicals that provide fuel, that provide gas, that provide air to the astronauts, and all of these different things and all the telemetry, all of the data that say everything is good for this rocket to go, and we're providing it all of these things that they need right up until launch to the very last minute. And they all fall away right at T0. Well, these aren't small things, right? They span 45 feet and they weigh 65,000 pounds in some cases. And they provide cryogenic liquids, which means that they're at, extremely low temperatures and are highly flammable. Well, so each one of these things could cause a catastrophic failure of the launch vehicle at T0 if they don't fall away perfectly, or if they don't move out of the way perfectly. So what we don't want to do is put them up there and for the very first time test them out and be like, hey, did that go well? Because we could lose both the crew and the rocket. So what we do at the Launch Equipment Test Facility is we test everything out multiple times in all sorts of failure modes. And so what that means is we test it in a primary failure mode. So we say, okay, if everything goes perfectly, what does it work like? If the primary release mechanism works or doesn't work, what happens? And so what we do is we'll release these umbilicals 50, 60 times in an entire simulated launch environment before we ever put it out there for launch, because we want to make sure that we are not going to put our crews and our launch vehicle at risk, because each one of these has potential catastrophic consequences. So that's what we do there. And so we have simulators that can do an entire launch sequence. We flow liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen. We flow helium, all sorts of commodities and gases through these umbilicals. We use full hydraulics that simulate everything we have on the mobile launcher, everything like that. And it's literally everything you would see in a launch day environment, so we can test it out at all ranges of the extreme envelopes. And so it's a very intense sort of facility, and we do very hazardous testing, but it's the best way to ensure that our astronauts and our people are going to be safe.